Mommy hasn't been the same since Sammy died. She was sad when Daddy died, but she still tucked us in at night and told us bedtime stories. She still made dinner for us every night when we came home from school. She still made turkey for Thanksgiving and decorated for Christmas. But ever since Sammy died last spring, Mommy hasn't been the same. Mommy doesn't tuck me in anymore. She eats ramen noodles and pizza for dinner and barely looks at me when she's eating. She microwaved a frozen turkey TV dinner for Thanksgiving. Mommy skipped Christmas altogether. Every year since Daddy died, Mommy put 3 stockings up at the fireplace, one for Mommy, one for Sammy, and one for me. But this past Christmas, she didn't hang any stockings up. Mommy didn't come to school for the parent-teachers conference last week. I think she may have forgotten about it. Or maybe Mommy's mad at me. Maybe Mommy blames me. I was the one who was supposed to look both ways. I was the one holding little Sammy's hand when we crossed the street to get on the school bus. But that day, I was too excited about our Easter party at school, and I couldn't wait to get on the school bus to show Anna my Easter basket. Mommy should be mad at me. It was my fault. Martha and Candace got out of the car at the cemetery parking lot. Martha shifted the flowers and teddy bear in her arms as she grabbed her purse. Today is the 1-year anniversary of that day. They walked towards the south end of the cemetery slowly, oblivious to the drizzling rain. The clicking of Martha's shoes on the pavement stopped abruptly as they reached their destination. They stepped into the field of grass towards the tombstones. Slowly, they walked down the rows until they saw the one they were looking for. Lovingly, Martha arranged the flowers and teddy bear in front of the headstone. She ran her fingers lightly over the letters in the greenish-grey stone as she read the hand-carved epitaph over and over. Sleep undisturbed. My little Sammy, December 6, 2008, April 14, 2017. And my lovely Candace, February 23, 2005, April 14, 2017. Sammy and Candace, Mommy loves you, Martha whispered, her tears blending with the drizzling rain, and I'm so sorry I couldn't take you guys to school that day. Confused, Candace stepped forward to comfort her mother. Only then, as her hand passed through her mother's shoulder, did she notice for the first time the words on the right side of the headstone. I'm bored now. Now that they've gone. I'm bored just sitting on my own in a darkened room, drumming my fingers on the arms of my chair. Although I'm not entirely on my own. It's there, staring at me, but not seeing anything. It will see if I want it to. But I can't. I can't let it see me. I've seen what it did, what I made it do, and now that they've gone, I'm afraid I'll be next. The smack came so hard to the back of my head that my nose hit the desk. I didn't make a sound, but they all laughed. I looked down at my notebook. There was blood on it now. Loser, I heard. I ignored the voice and dipped my pen into my own blood, trailing it across the page. I heard more sniggering and then a clatter of chairs as everybody rushed to take their seats when the teacher entered the room. Somebody tapped me on the arm, and when I looked, a piece of paper was shoved into my hand. Gay boy, it said. I screwed up my nose and the piece of paper. Ah, give me that, please, the teacher said, thrusting her palm towards me. I hadn't even noticed she'd stopped speaking. I put the note in her hand without looking up. I heard her sigh. Look at me, she said, and when I looked, she sighed again. Go and wash up. You're bleeding. She said it as if it was my fault. I pushed my chair back and got up. I left the room and didn't go back that day. My parents were angry. What are you building? He asked, peering over my shoulder as I tinkered with my tools. I couldn't be bothered to reply. He wouldn't understand anyway. So I said nothing. I asked what you were building, he said again. He waited a moment for my response. Then when it didn't come, he said, At least you're doing something, I suppose. Your mother's worried you're depressed or something. You're not, are you, depressed? I picked up a spanner and tightened a bolt, frowning that he wasn't leaving me in peace. I sighed loudly, hoping that he'd get the idea and leave. He growled impatiently. I asked you a damn question. You can at least have the decency to answer it, he said. I gathered my things, packed up my toolbox, and walked away. He threw a wrench at me. It hit me squarely between my shoulder blades. For a moment I stopped walking, but I didn't turn around. I'd been frowning over my notes when she came up behind me. I was sitting outside under a tree, trying to get the last of the light. I'd thought I was alone. Boo, she said, and she sat herself down beside me. I ignored her and wrote down something else in my notebook. This was important stuff. I needed to get it absolutely right for when I came to putting everything together. She said nothing for a while, but I knew she was watching me. I could feel her eyes on me. They think you're gay at school, she said. Are you? I gave her a look and then turned back to my notes. She was one of the popular kids. I wasn't about to speak to her. I was sure that no matter what I said, it'd be turned back against me somehow. She grabbed at my crotch suddenly, and I gasped and hurried to my feet, dropping my notebook on the ground. She laughed, loudly. Anger bubbled up in me, and I snatched up my book and marched back towards the house. I guess that answers my question then, she called after me. She was a bitch. I was going to be a very rich and powerful man. I decided that a long time ago. My project was going to get me the recognition I deserved. I took apart the computers at school to get the parts I needed. They only caught me once, and I was given a detention for it and ordered to give the parts back. I didn't bother. They soon replaced them anyway. The boy who I sat detention with beat me up and called me a loser. I kicked him in the groin, and he responded by punching me until I blacked out. I remember waking up in the hospital and hardly being able to see as my eyes were swollen almost shut. That put my work back for some days. I lay in bed and thought of nothing but motherboards and gyros and motion sensors. I went back to the same school. My parents didn't want to move me anywhere else. I suppose they didn't think I was worth the bother. Freak. This was from the boys at school. Then one of them put his finger and his thumb to his forehead, forming an L shape. Loser, he said, and they all laughed. Personally, I thought he looked like an idiot. I smiled and moved on my way down the corridor. I believed in karma, and they get what was coming to them. After all, I'd nearly finished it. My baby, my pride and joy. I was going to be famous. I felt like laughing like a maniac. I wanted to throw back my head and laugh like one of those crazed scientists that I had seen on TV. Instead, I grinned like a schoolboy and ran to get my mother. When she came up to my room and I unveiled my masterpiece, she was silent for some time. I waited patiently. "That's very nice, dear," she said. Her pause was enough to tell me that she was lying to me. I'd worked hard on this, and she couldn't even be honest with me, or lie well. I frowned and looked from my creation back to my mother. She had a look of vague disgust on her face. "I think we should put it in the garage," she said. When I didn't respond immediately, she said, "Well, the garage. Go on, put it away." I picked up the remote control and pressed the activate button. I'd show her what it could do. I remember watching as it speared my mother through the heart. I'd given it legs so it was able to go downstairs. It killed my father too, though I missed that. I hid in my room, my heart pounding, as my baby took on a life of its own. I'd poured my love into that thing and my hate. It was murderous. That's not what I had intended, but I took pleasure in hearing the screams fill the street as my creation destroyed everyone I knew and loathed. When I peered out of the window, I saw it carve up the girl from school. I think that she screamed the loudest. That turned me on more than anything. and I slid a hand down my pants as I watched. Then everything went quiet for a while, and I went to sit at my desk to wait. When it returned to me, the once shining silver metal was crusted with dried brown blood and other matter that I didn't like to hazard a guess at. I reached for the control and turned it off. Then I sat and stared at it, wondering what to do next. I was bored now that they'd gone. It couldn't have been Mom, or at least that was Jeremiah's best guess. The fact that he was still alive was a clear indication of that. Blackness, nothing but dense darkness surrounded him. He tried to maneuver, but the space was limited. In fact, he was barely able to separate his arms from his body. Lifting his hand, he jammed his thumb on the roof, which was only inches above him. Several times he banged on the roof as hard as he could. The stiff sound of his strikes, unable to resonate through the uncertain surface that lay on top of him. He inspected himself up and down. A suit, a tie, and even his yakama. It all started to sink in, albeit as hard a notion it was to comprehend. Hyperventilating, the sound of his breathing brushed along the walls of his congested quarter. He tried desperately to remember what he could. Where he was before this. How did this happen? Why couldn't he remember anything? All these questions and more raced through his mind, but none as terrifying as the most apparent fact. He was buried alive. Jeremiah let out several bellows, screaming in short bursts as he could feel the air beginning to deplete in quality, the smell and taste of his expended breaths beginning to take its place. He knew he had only a few minutes or less, accounting for the amount of time he'd been here already. He continued his attempts to desperately claw his way through the roof, but did nothing but bruise his fingers as they now began to bleed. He could feel the dampness of his blood within the padded lining of the roof. Jeremiah ripped and clawed at the padding, trying to give himself a sense of progress in his escape. From the corner, he managed to separate a piece of fabric with his thumb and forefinger, tearing it from the seam. Jeremiah did his best to feel out the edges and, taking a firm grip of the exposed lining, pulled with what strength and leverage he could muster. He managed to pull away a large section of fabric of about 2 square feet. Though he couldn't see anything, the feeling of making headway, as well as the solid surface, was motivating. He patted the slab of wood above him, trying to hear any semblance of an echo, a vibration of any kind that would give him a sense of hope. His blows, however hard, fell flat, but Jeremiah pounded until his muscles were numb, crying and laughing in a growing uncontrollable hysteria. All he could think of was how he could have ended up here. Amongst the tears and the sharp breaths, he tried his best to imagine how and why someone could have made such a mistake. Did they think he was dead? Why? What had happened? What was the last thing he could remember? Nothing. There was nothing he could recall. He never really did anything out of the ordinary. His routine was pretty standard. He only had 2 friends he could speak of, or at least those he would go out of his way to spend time with. His best friend Dan, who he spoke to on and off during the week, and would drop by his house every so often. When did I talk to him last? It was? God, when was it? Thursday? Friday? He thought back. As best he could remember, he hadn't heard from Dan in days, probably due to the obvious circumstance. What about Trish? He thought. Surely she must realize he's not around. Jeremiah kept in better contact with her. They had a much longer history and were a pair that could share more intimate details. Whatever the reason for this, he was sure Trish had to know of it in some manner. There were nights upon nights when Jeremiah couldn't sleep that he would be able to call her and talk for however long until, I never could sleep, he began to recall. Jeremiah suffered from chronic insomnia, only able to sleep a few hours a night if at all. There were times where he even went on 2 or 3 days without a wink. By that 3rd day, his delirium and disorientation were in full swing. However, that following night's sleep was never sounder for him. but the years of such a condition had really taken its toll. There was something, he thought, the drug trials. It was starting to come back. He had visited the hospital recently for yet another complaint about a string of sleepless nights. With his prescription filled, Jeremiah left for home. Once there, he sat at his computer to turn off his brain for a while. A few hours of web browsing often helped aid in his sleeplessness. This night, he had received an email about a new drug that was being put into human trials, a long-term treatment for insomnia. At this point, he was willing to try anything. While typical sleeping pills managed to take the edge off for a while, Jeremiah was in the market for something sustainable, something he could rely on. While the list of side effects were typical: headaches, muscle weakness and stiffness, joint pain and such, it was a fair gamble. Nowhere on that list, however, did it mention being buried alive. Still, he could only wonder how it came to this. The trial. I had taken the meds, and the congestion continued to weigh on Jeremiah, almost as if he could feel the pressure of the earth suffocating him. He tried desperately to shorten his breathing, to prolong his life as much as he could. Continuously, he would tap the far end of the coffin with his toe to give himself a readable dimension of his spacing. There wasn't much to go on. Nothing had changed, but the continuous inspection gave him something to focus on. When he had regained some strength in his arms, he continued to feel around the torn area and ripped away more of the fabric. As the dementia began to set in, his thoughts became more panic-stricken and unnerved. He continued to laugh hysterically, gripping his hair and squeezing it tightly, pulling his scalp up and feeling the hair rip from his head. He began to flail and convulse, striking all areas of the coffin with disturbed and erratic movements. He began to realize and understand his fate now. In a few moments he would pass out and die soon after. In an ironic sense, his insomnia would be cured, though a different method might have been preferred. Still, how did this happen? He continued to wonder. His last moments would be spent trying to figure out what had happened. Answers would provide some comfort, at least. He could only recall one treatment he participated in. It had to be recent as only a few days ago. I remember, he thought, being in the room. He recalled several other patients sitting around him in a lab while two doctors presented their latest treatment for sleep deprivation, Salterville. The tests were purported to show promise and were ready to be taken to the next level in human trials. The risks were clear and the money was intriguing. The profits for being a guinea pig weren't a get-rich-quick scheme by any means, but it was a way to pull in some fast cash when needed, as Jeremiah did. With his job-slashing hours, he had lost a significant amount of income, and the stress only added to his insomnia. Not able to think clearly, his struggles turned to desperation. A simple dose of 2 pills 1 hour before intending to sleep were all the instruction they were given. They would return after 30 days of treatment to report their results. As it turns out, he might not make that meeting. 30 days. Had it been that long? It couldn't have been. He'd most certainly be dead by now. What then? What was the last thing he could remember? From his first meeting in the lab, he went home and went about his routine until it was time to sleep. He settled down and, the images became so fuzzy. Nothing was clear. Did he even take the medication? Did he take the wrong ones? Did they give him the wrong ones? Curiosity turned to anger when the possibility occurred to him that someone else's mistake could put him here. He broke into tears hysteria before starting to laugh again. The sheer reality of what had happened was absolutely absurd. Wasn't he examined thoroughly enough before his burial? Well, as far as Jewish tradition goes, the dead are to be buried within a day or two of death. Still, where was he beforehand? Jeremiah began to cough a bit as the air became increasingly toxic. He knew he would officially be dead soon. He continued to scream in a panicked state. Hadn't the company done a thorough enough check with its subjects? There must have been more that had suffered the same disturbing fate as him. Were they buried too? He thought. They had to be. His brain quickly ran from rational to senselessness. One moment he would be in tears, then a sudden lash out at the coffin, in a sense of the world, then to fits of laughter. As the air grew thicker, he began to babble to himself. Someone had to have seen me before this. No one noticed me breathing. How? His anger grew. Accept the fact that Jeremy's dead. No one cares. Just bury the fucker. Right. He continued to cough. This is it, he yelled. The air tasted bad, very polluted. Jeremiah felt the urge to throw up. He held it back as long as he could, but the sensation was too much. As he turned his head as far to the right as his neck would allow and retched, immediately the smell only made matters worse. He continued to cough and spit up whatever was left inside him. The vomit sat in a puddle next to his ear, and he could feel it settling around his head until the cushions absorbed the liquid. It started out a dreadful warm, then cooled to decaying room earthly temperature. The smell hung heavy still, adding to the toxic concoction that was slowly choking him. With no watch or phone, Jeremiah had no ability to tell how much time had elapsed since he came to. He felt, however, that it had been several minutes, 10, maybe 20. How was he still alive or conscious for that matter? Surely the conditions and length of time succumbing thereto was enough to do him in. Why hadn't he expired? He drifted in and out of senility, losing bits and pieces of time, but yet never dying. It was here he lost all track of how long it had been. An hour too. A day. My God, how could he have survived this long? Jeremiah began to rap on the roof of the coffin with what strength he had left. The efforts in vain he knew, also aware of the effect such a labour would have on his psyche. Dashing hope with every knock, the results became that much clearer. No one was coming. No one could hear him. He was trapped, buried alive. Why? He desperately wondered. Why won't I die? If the cause of him being here was the drug treatment, it had to be the reason for this as well. It can't be true. The only salvation was the comfort in knowing he would die. But if he hadn't by now, would he ever meet his death? The thought of still being alive after all this time not only opened his eyes to something extraordinary, something that no one would ever know about. Jeremiah knew it was a grim torture that he would be buried alive forever.